In September of 1890, a clerk in Washington, D.C. opened a ledger and wrote a name at the top of a blank page. Not a person's name, a place. The place already existed. People had been living there, farming there, burying their dead there for generations. But until that clerk wrote it down in that ledger, the federal government of the United States had no official position on what it was called. That changed on September 4th, 1890, when President Benjamin Harrison signed Executive Order 29. It was 4 paragraphs long. It created the United States Board on Geographic Names, and it gave that board something no government body had ever held before: final authority over what every location in America would be called on every federal map, every federal document, and every federal publication in perpetuity. The order was presented as a practical measure. By 1890, the problem was real and measurable. The same river appeared under 6 different spellings across 6 different government surveys. The War Department called a mountain one thing. The Post Office called it another. The Treasury used a third. Surveyors, soldiers, and census takers had been moving across a continent for a century, each one writing down what they heard or thought they heard, in whatever spelling felt right to them that afternoon. The result was a federal archive of magnificent, incompatible chaos. The solution was a board of 7 members, representatives from the Coast and Geodetic Survey, the Geological Survey, the Post Office, the War Department, the Navy, the Interior Department, and the Smithsonian Institution. They would meet, deliberate, and issue decisions. Those decisions would be final. No appeal was specified in the order, no expiration date, no requirement to notify the communities whose names were being decided. The board's first annual report, published in 1892 and available today through the National Archives under Record Group 57, opens with a statement of purpose that takes up exactly 1 paragraph. It describes the board's mission as bringing order to the geographic nomenclature of the United States. It uses the word standardize 4 times in 2 pages. It does not use the word replace, but replacement is what the record shows. In that first report, the board announced 215 decisions. Names that had appeared on official maps for decades were ruled non-standard. A single preferred form was chosen. The others were designated synonyms, a bureaucratic category that meant, in practice, that they would not appear on future maps, not prohibited, not erased in a single moment, simply no longer printed. And in a country where maps were how most people understood the landscape beyond their own county line, a name that didn't appear on maps was a name that was slowly becoming invisible. Consider what the board was actually deciding in those first sessions. The rules they established in 1890 had teeth. Possessive forms, names ending in apostrophes, were eliminated. The board's 1892 decision circular states the principle directly. The possessive form is to be avoided in geographic names. It is a small grammatical choice with an enormous consequence. Every place in America that had been named for a person, named in the possessive, named to show belonging, named because someone had built something or died there or been remembered there, lost that apostrophe. Pikes Peak became Pikes Peak. Harper's Ferry, already possessiveless, stayed, but hundreds of smaller places, local names, family names, names that lived in county deed records and church logs and the speech of people who had been there for a century, lost the mark of possession. The person remained, technically. The belonging was removed. The board also established a preference for single-word forms over hyphenated ones, and for anglicized spellings over phonetic transcriptions of non-English words. This second rule deserves to be read slowly. The United States in 1890 was a country whose landscape had been named in dozens of languages. Spanish names ran from California to Florida. French names ran from Louisiana up through the Great Lakes. Dutch names sat along the Hudson. German names had spread through Pennsylvania and the Midwest. And beneath all of those, older than all of those, were thousands of names in languages the board members did not speak, had never studied, and in many cases had never heard pronounced by someone who knew them. The board's solution to this was to accept anglicized spellings as the preferred form where they existed. Where they did not exist, the board would create one. The Smithsonian's representative, a linguist named William Henry Holmes, argued in early sessions for phonetic accuracy, for preserving, as closely as possible, the sound of the original name. He was outvoted. The majority position, recorded in the meeting minutes now held at the National Archives, was that clarity for the English-speaking public outweighed fidelity to the original. What this looked like in practice was this: a mountain that a community of Lakota people had called by a name meaning something specific, a description of what you saw from its summit, or what had happened there, or what lived there, would be transcribed into Roman letters according to what an English-speaking surveyor thought he heard on a single afternoon in the field. That transcription would go to Washington. The board would look at it, compare it to any other spellings in the record, choose the form that looked most manageable to an English reader, and issue a decision. The decision would stand. The names were not always wrong. Some transcriptions were careful, some anglicizations preserved genuine sound and meaning. But the process itself contained no requirement for accuracy, no mechanism for community input, no procedure by which the people who had used a name for generations could tell the board what it actually was. The first systematic challenge to this came not from native communities, who had no formal standing before the board, but from the United States Post Office. The Post Office, it turned out, had been naming things on its own for decades. Every new post office required a name. Postmasters General had been issuing those names with no coordination with anyone else, and by 1890, the postal map of America was a parallel universe of names that existed nowhere else. The board spent its first years adjudicating between federal agencies, each of which had been building its own geographic vocabulary in isolation. What emerged from those early decisions was a hierarchy. Federal survey names outranked postal names, which outranked state names, which outranked local usage. The community that had been calling a place something for 100 years ranked at the bottom of that hierarchy. Not because of a rule that said so explicitly, because there was no rule that said otherwise. By 1906, the board had issued decisions on more than 17,000 names. By 1932, the number exceeded 50,000. Each decision is in the record. The USGS Geographic Names Information System, available today at geonames.usgs.gov, contains over 2 million entries. Every entry has a history. Many of those histories contain what the database calls variant names. Those variants are the names that lost. They are still there, in the system, tagged as non-standard. They are the names that were spoken, that were written in letters and land deeds and church records, that were carried in the memory of communities, and then were ruled incorrect by a board that never visited the places it was naming. Here is the detail that stopped me when I first found it in the 1892 annual report. The board, in its first year, received a protest, a formal, written protest submitted through proper channels from a town in Virginia. The town had been known by one name for 60 years. The board had ruled a different spelling standard. The town wrote to say that the board's preferred form was not how anyone there had ever spelled it, not how it appeared in the county deed books, not how it appeared on the stone above the post office door. The board's response is recorded in the minutes. They acknowledged the protest, they noted the community's preference, and then they reaffirmed their original decision. Because standardization, the minutes state, requires uniformity, and uniformity, by definition, cannot accommodate every local preference. The town's name in the county deed books and the town's name on the federal map became two different things that year. That gap between what a community called itself and what the federal government called it is not a footnote. It is the structure the board built. It ran in one direction, and it ran for over a century before anyone in Washington was required to ask whether it should. On March 3, 1917, a man named Arthur Randall walked into a federal building in Birmingham, Alabama, and submitted a formal petition to the board on geographic names. He was not a surveyor or a government official. He was a black landowner from Jefferson County. He was there to ask the board to restore a name. The name was Freedman's Bend. It had appeared on county maps since 1868. It marked a stretch of the Cahaba River where formerly enslaved families had settled after emancipation, had cleared land, had built a community from nothing in the years when the Freedmen's Bureau still existed and federal support still reached, however briefly, into the Deep South. The community had named the bend themselves. It was their name, given to a place they had made. Sometime before 1910, the name had changed on federal maps. The USGS survey sheet for that section of Jefferson County now read Farmers Bend. No decision record exists in the BGN files for that specific change. It may have happened at the surveyor level before it ever reached Washington. A man in the field, transcribing names onto a sheet, had written something different. The original went into the archive as a variant. The new name went onto the map. Arthur Randall's petition is in the National Archives. It runs to 3 pages. It lists the families who had settled Freedmen's Bend by name. It describes the cleared land and the church they had built. It asks the board to restore the original name on the grounds that it was the established, documented, community-given name of the place and had been for 50 years. The board's response is also in the archive. It is 1 paragraph. The board thanks Mr. Randall for his communication. It notes that the current name, Farmers Bend, has appeared on federal maps for over a decade and is therefore the established standard. The petition is denied. This is not an isolated case. It is a type, and the archive is full of types. The GNIS Variant Name Database, if you spend enough time inside it, reveals a pattern that the board's annual reports never describe directly, but that the data makes impossible to ignore. Names that carried the prefix Negro, a federally accepted designation used on USGS maps from the 1880s through the mid-20th century, appear as the standard form for hundreds of geographic features across the South and Midwest: springs, creeks, hollows, bends, and rivers. The communities near those features are in many cases the descendants of the people those names described. They did not give those places those names. The names were assigned by surveyors who were not members of those communities, in a language of designation rather than belonging. Some of those names were changed in the 1960s during the Civil Rights era, when the board began issuing guidance, not binding decisions, guidance against racially derogatory terms and geographic names. Some were changed again after a 1963 Interior Department directive that specifically addressed the prefix in question. But the directive was not retroactive in effect. It required new decisions, new filings, new processes. Communities that wanted a name changed had to petition. The burden of initiating correction fell on the communities that had not assigned the names in the first place. The last federally designated feature using the most common derogatory racial prefix, applied to a lake in California, was not renamed until 2022. That decision, BGN Decision List 22001, is in the current Federal Register. The name had been on federal maps for over 90 years. Now, consider the parallel track. At almost exactly the same time, the BGN was standardizing the anglicization of Native American place names in its early decades. The Bureau of American Ethnology at the Smithsonian was doing something different. It was collecting. BAE linguists in the 1890s and early 1900s fanned out across the country with notebooks, recording the actual names, the sounds, the meanings, the grammatical structures of thousands of geographic features as they were known in the languages of the communities who had named them. Those notebooks are in the Smithsonian archives today. Some have been digitized. The BGN and the BAE were funded by the same government. They operated in the same decade. They occasionally shared personnel. William Henry Holmes, the Smithsonian linguist who argued for phonetic accuracy in BGN sessions, also contributed to BAE research. But the two institutions had no binding relationship. The BAE's records were research. The BGN's decisions were law. The careful linguistic documentation sitting in Smithsonian notebooks had no mechanism to reach the board that was deciding what names would appear on federal maps. What this produced, and the Geographic Record makes this concrete, is a landscape where the federal name and the community name for the same place are often two different things. in two different languages, meaning two different things, going back to two different understandings of what happened there. The federal name is on the map. The community name is in the archive, tagged as a variant, which in the BGN's taxonomy means not standard, not for use on official documents. But here's what the BGN record also shows, and what makes this more than a story about bureaucratic indifference. In 1947, the board received a request from the state of Alaska, then a territory, to begin standardizing the names of geographic features in what would become the 49th state. Alaska presented a specific problem. It had been named in Russian. Its native communities spoke over 20 distinct languages. Its American settlers had been naming things informally since the 1867 purchase, often on top of Russian names, often on top of native names that had existed for centuries before either. The board's 1947 Alaska project produced something unprecedented in its history, a formal consultation process. BGN representatives met with Native Alaskan community leaders in several regions. They recorded preferred name forms. They issued decisions that in some cases, not all, but some, incorporated the phonetic preferences of the communities involved. The minutes from those 1947 consultations are in the National Archives. They are the first minutes in the board's history, going back to 1890, that record a Native community's spoken preference for a place name and document whether that preference was followed. 57 years after the board was created, 2 years before Alaska was a state. In the lower 48 states, that process did not begin until the 1990s, when the board established a formal policy allowing federally recognized tribes to petition for the restoration of traditional place names. The policy is in the current BGN Procedures Manual, Section 5. As of the most recent annual report, 312 such petitions have been granted since 1994. The total number of features in the GNIS database is 2.3 million. There is one more document. It sits in the National Archives, Record Group 383, Box 14. It is a letter dated November 12, 1934, written by a BGN staff geographer named Lewis Crawford to the board's executive secretary. Crawford had spent 6 months reviewing variant name records from the board's first 40 years of decisions. His letter is not a protest. It is a professional assessment. He writes, and I am paraphrasing from the archival language, that a review of the variant records suggests that in a substantial number of early decisions, the name designated as non-standard was, based on available documentation, the older and better attested form. That the name chosen as standard was, in several categories of cases, the more recently introduced form, originating with a surveyor's field notation rather than established local usage. He recommends a review process. The letter has a handwritten notation in the margin in a different hand. It reads, "Filed. No action taken." The 2.3 million names in the federal database were not given to those places by the people who lived near them. They were decided by a board created in 1890, operating under rules that prioritized uniformity over accuracy, federal usage over community usage, and the notation on a surveyor's field sheet over the name that had been spoken in that place for 100 years before the surveyor arrived. The names are still there. The decisions are in the archive. The variant names, the ones that lost, are tagged in the database, waiting. Lewis Crawford's letter recommending a review sits in Box 14. The handwritten notation that ended the matter is still visible in the margin. It says, "Filed. No action taken." Every name that was replaced is still in the federal database, tagged as a variant, not deleted, just ruled non-standard. 2 million entries, hundreds of thousands of variants. The board that made those decisions is still active. It issued 847 new decisions last year alone. The process Crawford described in 1934, the process where the surveyor's notation outranks the community's name, is still the default. The archive is open. The decisions are public. The names that lost are still there, waiting for someone to look them up. That is not a coincidence. That is a filing system, and a filing system is a choice about what gets remembered. If this channel exists for one reason, it is this: The documents were always there. What was missing was someone willing to read them. Subscribe, because next week we open another file